Chapter 8. When Amon told Balashi about his subterfuge, and the part Balashi was to play in it, subtly omitting the fact that he had revealed his true identity to Iltani after Balashi had made him promise not to do so, he was not amused. "Lies have short legs," Balashi said, repeating the proverb. "This lie's legs are very short indeed, for all it would require would be to send a messenger to chat with anyone in old Wardham's household for its legs to fall off altogether." "That would be tough, since I never mentioned the name of Wardham to them," Amon replied acidly. "And anyhow, aren't you the same man who wanted me to pretend to be your weak-minded son?" "No pretense would be required. You are weak-minded. How else to explain your sudden, amazing discovery that you are the High Priestess's brother?" Balashi replied. "Sons with weak minds have fathers with weak minds," Amon said. "Are you going to help me or not?" "I am not," Balashi said firmly. "I have work to do, and I'm not going to ask my lord for leave after having worked for him for a few short days." "It would be a great honor for you," Amon insisted. "You could at least tell him the circumstances and see what he says." "And what shall I tell him when he asks why my son was invited to the temple?" Balashi wanted to know. "You already told him that you have a son?" Amon asked. To be honest, I haven't said more than 3 words to the lord at all," Balashi admitted. "All of my dealings are with the chief steward." "And did you tell the chief steward that you have a son?" Amon queried. Balashi sucked his teeth. "I don't know for sure," he admitted. "If you don't know, then the chief steward surely doesn't know either. The only person you told I was your son was Mazizi," Amon said. "Perhaps," Balashi allowed. "Can't you tell the chief steward that you've been invited to dine at the temple and leave it at that?" "Fine, I will ask. But if your story is to carry any credibility, it must have some detail." Now, it was Amon's turn to sigh. Balashi was going to make him invent an entire backstory, wasn't he? "Let's flesh out this skeleton of a story you've created," Balashi said. Amon rolled his eyes. "Why are we here in the city?" Balashi asked. "I told you you're my retainer, and I brought you to protect me on the journey from Eridu," Amon said petulantly. "Then why have I taken employment with the new lord?" Balashi demanded. That brought Amon up short. It wouldn't take much effort to find out that Balashi was a guard for some minor lord. That put a neat hole through Amon's story. He thought for a while. "How about this?" Amon suggested. "You and I never got on very well, but out of respect for my father, I offered to keep you on. You proposed instead that you would come with me to Uruk, since I was already planning to come, and asked that I put in a good word for you to find a new employer. That saved me from taking some other servant along who couldn't be spared, and it gave you the chance to get away from me with no hard feelings all around." Balashi nodded slowly. "That's not bad," he admitted. Amon sighed. "If I'd decided to be one of Wardham's other bastards, rather than the one to inherit, I would need no backstory, and no one would have any way to prove or disprove it." "When the sheep have left the fold, it's no use closing the gate," Balashi told him. "Thanks, I feel so much better," Amon said sarcastically. "I'm glad. So, tell me, young Etana, how many trees do you have under cultivation?" Balashi asked. 60, Amon replied without hesitation. "A third are at old growth, a third are at peak production, and a third are yet too young to produce well." That was good. Very convincing," Balashi said approvingly. "Oh, and before I forget, I'm 15 years old," Amon added. "You certainly act like it," Balashi agreed. Amon stuck out his tongue at his bodyguard. "I chose to be 15 so that the temple council sees me as less threatening. What harm can a 15-year-old little boy do?" "That brings up an excellent point," Balashi pointed out. "Before you go supposing yourself to be the great Gilgamesh, perhaps you should stop and think that you really are about the size of a 15-year-old boy, and you're not much more capable than one. So don't go pulling on the beards of any lions, because you will regret it, and I'll probably end up regretting it too." "Did you forget that you're speaking to Urma Oog?" Amon demanded with a wicked grin. "I don't just pull on lions' beards, I cut out their hearts." I didn't hear you promise me that you wouldn't go trying to play the hero, Balashi said.
Who would I play the hero against? Amon demanded. A 2,000-year-old crone? I can see the title of the great poem now, Urma Ug and the Deadly Grandmother.
Your girlfriend seems to think that there is something deadly in all of this, Balashi insisted. Amon smiled to hear Balashi call Iltani his girlfriend.
My girlfriend, he replied, savouring the taste of the word, has never left the temple grounds. She might be seeing spiders and imagining them to be demons.
It wasn't a very loyal sentiment, but he wasn't going to hold back from sharing his fears with Balashi. Maybe, Balashi conceded. But from what you told me of her, she's both intelligent and well-educated, and smart girls usually aren't scared of nothing.
I suppose,
Amon agreed.
Though I once knew a smart girl who was afraid of butterflies.
Really? Butterflies? Balashi asked.
Really,
Amon confirmed.
She hated them because they used to be caterpillars, and caterpillars have that strange wiggly way of moving.
Amon held up his finger and made an inchworm motion. Balashi was clearly warming to the idea of accompanying Amon, but he wasn't completely on board yet, so Amon tried to think of something else that might be tempting enough to win him over completely.
I bet it's going to be a fantastic dinner, Amon suggested. Maybe they'll have turtle soup.
If this old crone is as suspicious of you as you say, more likely they will have Prince of Eridu soup, Balashi warned. If you are to go, you have a lot more work to do on this backstory you have to come up with. If they ask me questions about you, and I must invent something, your story and mine need to match.
Was it not you who taught me that the best lies stick as close to the truth as possible? For any childhood experiences they ask about, just tell them actual stories from my childhood. You know everything that's happened to me well enough, and any minor variations can be ascribed to imperfect memory.
You make it sound so simple, Balashi replied. But it's not simple.
It's not so difficult either, Amon countered. Old Wardham's lands are quite close to the palace gardens. You can tell stories of the daredevil child who would sneak onto the palace grounds to have this or that adventure. In fact, now that I think on it, when I was small I seem to recall having run into Itana and some of his friends, stealing olives from that bitter tree that father always refused to chop down. Why in heaven's name a boy who lived next to an olive orchard would sneak onto the palace grounds to steal bitter olives is beyond me. He would have done much better to go after pomegranates or apples, but that's beside the point. The point is, the stories need only be plausible, and if you tell them as they really occurred, then we'll never be caught up in a lie.
Balashi harumphed, but he said no more about the matter. When they arrived at the temple, one of the priestesses was on the lookout for them, and led them back into the temple complex, to one of the buildings where Amon had not yet been. The priestess had pretty green eyes, and chatted animatedly with Amon as they walked. Amon made a couple of jokes that had her laughing out loud, and he turned to Balashi to grin in triumph, but Balashi's face was like a stone. When the priestess's attention was distracted for a moment by another passing temple functionary, Balashi grabbed Amon's arm and pulled him away. "Remember why we're here," he hissed. Amon rolled his eyes, but he stopped trying to be charming. Like the rest of the buildings in the temple complex, this one was made of expensive baked bricks, and had broad stone steps leading up to the entrance. There were statues to either side of the door, but Amon didn't have to puzzle over what these ones were supposed to be. On the left side was Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, with a cup held high. On the right was Dumuzi, god of food, holding a full platter. As they entered, Amon could see that most of the building was taken up with a vast dining hall, but their guide led them through the vast hall to a much smaller dining room near the kitchens. The entire building smelled of good things to eat. The aroma of onions frying in butter and roasting meat suggested that perhaps Amon was not far off in his guess that turtle soup would be served. The priestess bade them be seated, then disappeared from the room. Amon sat on the right side, near the head of the long table. He had to take care to tuck his new robe under him properly. Balashi sat directly across from him, also taking care with his new robe. Balashi had insisted that they spend the tiny amount of their savings on the new clothes. They were cheap and itchy, but Balashi said they were much more proper than the short tunics which were their only other raiment. His robes properly tucked away, Amon looked around at the empty room. "I guess we're early,"
Amon observed. Balashi just grunted. He wasn't inclined to idle chit-chat. The more they spoke, the greater the chance that one of them would slip up and forget to refer to Amon as Etana or something else equally boneheaded. As far as he was concerned, the less he said, the better. And as he thought about all of the many ways that he or Amon might betray Amon's identity, he suddenly remembered that he had failed to warn Amon against drinking. With a fuzzy head and loose tongue, only bad things could result.
If you don't want to have loose bowels for a week, you had best remember not to drink any alcohol, Balashi warned Amon. Amon did not reply for a moment. His bowels tolerated alcohol just fine, and like most other spoiled rich kids, he had been drinking expensive beer since before he could walk. In fact, he had been looking forward to the high-quality beers they were likely to have here at the temple. He had been drinking nothing but water for too many days now. It took too long, but he finally realized what Balashi could be warning him against. Strange-tasting beers could be poisoned, and the drinker wouldn't recognize the odd flavor of the poison until it was too late. A moment of reflection told him that that wasn't it. If Balashi thought there was a risk of poison, he would never have agreed to dinner. Maybe Balashi was afraid he couldn't hold his liquor and would get drunk. Come to think of it, it would be very easy for them to prepare really strong beer that could have Amon spilling his guts within an hour.
"Thank you for the reminder," Amon said. "I'll be sure to let them know that I can't drink beer."
Balashi just grunted again in response. He looked nervous and irritable. They sat there staring at each other in silence for a very long, uncomfortable time. When at last Iltani came into the room, Amon stood up politely. He was about to make an appropriately brotherly comment when he had to do a double-take. Iltani had been transformed. Her curly hair had been combed and oiled until it shone like obsidian in the lamplight. Her makeup had been so expertly applied that Amon could barely tell that it was there, yet her every feature had been subtly highlighted. A touch of black around her eyes, a pale blue powder on her eyelids, a hint of blush to her cheeks, and a deep red color to her lips. Sparkling gems adorned every one of her fingers, and an elaborate silver and pearl necklace glittered in the hollow of her throat.
"Dear sister, however will you eat with such large stones weighing down your fingers?" he teased. "Have you offended the temple council so that your punishment will be to sit and watch while everyone else eats?"
Iltani repressed a faint smile, but her eyes slid first to one side of the room, then to the other, and she said,
"Dear brother, you have a light-hearted spirit, but do not forget that it is the High Priestess of Inanna that you address."
If she had said, "Our every movement and word is being watched," her message could not have been clearer.
"Forgive me, your holiness," Amon said, as he dropped to his knees. "My weak head must become accustomed to the exalted heights to which my sister has ascended. I am nothing but a humble farmer, and I scarcely know the correct way to act in such illustrious company."
"You are forgiven," Iltani said regally.
"But please, do not attempt such levity with our other guests."
"No, your holiness," Amon agreed. He had hoped that, with Iltani's arrival, the awkward silence would end, but if anything, it had become 3 times as awkward as it was previously. Fortunately, only a short time after Iltani arrived, the rest of the company entered. Amon and Balashi had seated themselves after the High Priestess entered, but now a pair of priestesses each firmly escorted Balashi and Amon out of the chairs they occupied, to the foot of the table. Akala and a dozen people Amon had never met filed in and lined up along the sides of the table. From their very dress and mannerisms, Amon was certain that not all of them were associated with the temple. They each stood behind their chairs expectantly. Iltani stood at the head of the table and held out her arms. "O beneficent Inanna, protector and provider, we thank you for the feast you have provided, for your protection from our enemies, and for our great emperor. Protect and preserve him as you protect and preserve us all." Iltani lifted a cup and poured a generous portion of beer on the floor. "Accept this libation and our thanks, we pray. Amen." The rest of the guests intoned their amens. Then Iltani sat, and the rest of the guests each sat in order, beginning at the head of the table and continuing to the foot. Amon couldn't help but disdain the excessive pageantry of these Urukai. Even the most pompous state occasion in Eridu had never been accompanied by sitting down in rank of importance. Amon couldn't help but feel slighted to be the last one seated. He had no doubt that if only the temple functionaries had thought of it, they would have replaced the chairs he and Balashi sat in with rickety, 3-legged stools. Servants began pouring in and out of the room with cups, dishes, and utensils. The man to Amon's right leaned over and spoke to him.
"My name's Dongi," he said.
"Itana," Amon replied. "It's strange to see a boy here amongst this company," Dongi observed. Amon bristled, but the open, friendly face of the corpulent Dungi suggested that his comment held no malice. Best to keep his cool and to be polite. "The High Priestess, Iltani Eninana, and I are kin," Amon replied evenly. "I'm here tonight at the invitation of Rakala."
"Ah, the old crone invited you here to grill you, did she?"
Dongi answered, with a commiserating shake of his head, earning an immediate improvement in Amon's estimation of him.
"Beware that one. Like a spider at the centre of her web, she is. Nothing passes her notice in all of Uruk,"
Dongi warned. "Thank you for the warning," Amon said. "But I don't plan to remain in Uruk for too long. I am a denizen of Eridu, and hope to return there sooner rather than later."
"You speak pretty fancy for a kid," Dongi observed.
Amon noticed that, in contrast, Dongi didn't speak well at all. His elocution was poor, and his vocabulary worse. In fact, he seemed more out of place here than Amon did. "If I may ask," Amon said politely, "what is it that you do, Dungi?"
"I'm glad you asked," Dongi said enthusiastically. "I'm a merchant. I deal mostly in pottery, but I have a side business in beer, linens, and lamp oil, and I'm looking to expand in other directions as well."
"What sort of pottery?" Amon asked, though already he felt his interest waning. Merchants, even really wealthy ones, were not considered part of polite society and tended to be looked down upon by nearly everyone.
"I am the primary supplier for the Silas balls in all of Uruk,"
Dongi replied proudly. Amon looked blank. "Do you sell many Silas balls in Uruk?" he inquired.
"Do I sell many Silas balls?"
Dongi asked with a chuckle.
"My workmen are turning out 3,600 bowls every day, and even at that rate we can barely keep up with demand."
"That seems excessive," Amon told him.
"Well, all those workmen got to get paid somehow, right?"
Dongi replied. Amon was stumped momentarily by the non sequitur, until he realized that a Silas ball of grain was the standard payment unit for servants. What had Balashi said he was getting paid in his new job? 6 balls of barley per day? Since the palace had mostly slaves, and since Amon didn't have any reason to care about the wages of servants, he hadn't had much opportunity to learn about such minutiae. He began wishing that he could swap spots with Balashi. Maybe the bodyguard would be able to arouse some level of interest in Silas balls.
"I also make dried pots for transporting oil,"
Dongi explained. "Oh," Amon replied, even less interested in cheap dried pots than he was in Silas balls.
"Yep, I move a whole lot of olive oil through my warehouses each day,"
Dongi emphasized. "Sounds fascinating," Amon replied, unable to keep the sarcasm completely out of his voice. Suddenly, there was a large foot pressing down firmly on Amon's toe. Amon turned to look at Balashi, but the bodyguard was apparently completely absorbed in conversation with a marginally attractive woman to his left. Amon risked a quick glance underneath the table. The foot definitely belonged to Balashi, which meant that he was being warned about something. "I wonder what sort of food they'll be serving us," Amon said to Dongi, in order to buy a few seconds to think. Dongi made some sort of inconsequential response, while Amon surreptitiously looked about, his senses stretching to see what it was Balashi was warning him about.
"So, are you in some sort of trade, young man?"
Dongi was saying. Suddenly, Amon's brain made the connection, and he realized what Balashi was trying to tell him.
"Oh, yes,"
Amon replied heartily. "I'm in the olive business. I own an orchard of olive trees in Eridu, so we grow olives and make olive oil. I know just about everything there is to know about the olive business." Balashi's foot pressed his again, just slightly. Was Balashi trying to tell him that he was saying too much? He replayed in his mind what he had just said, and realized that he sounded like someone who hadn't a clue about the olive business, pretending that he was in the olive business. He took a mental breath and tried to calm down. Time to do some serious improvising. "So, you said you're in the dried pot business, didn't you?" Amon asked. "I don't suppose you sell fired pots as well?"
Well, you see, fired pots are much more expensive, Dungi pointed out. The type of business that I do, transportation and items for working men, requires me to keep costs down. Yes, Amon said. I can see that. My father, may Eresh Kagal give him rest, always liked to use dried pots for transporting our olive oil. Now that I'm in charge of the business, I was planning on moving to fired pots. They are much more expensive, but they are also much stronger. Can you believe that we lose 10% of our inventory in breakage? Now I don't mean to tell you your business, Etana, but fired pots aren't the answer to your breakage problem, Dungi said. What you want to do is make sure that when you go to ship your dried pots, you pack the crate with about 2 inches of good straw. And I'm not talking about just the bottom of the crate, I'm talking about all the way around. You have hit upon the heart of the matter, Amon said. You see, no matter how many times I tell those cretins to pack the crates with 2 inches of straw, they always skimp. You would think that the shekels for the straw were coming out of their pockets and not mine. Are you using slaves or hired servants to do the packing? Dungi asked. Father was saving up to get a few good, solid slaves, but with the poor harvest 2 years ago, our slave money had to go to our operating costs, Amon answered. At this point, a servant put a bowl of soup and a cup of beer in front of Dungi. Amon noticed that at the head of the table, the main course was already being served, but Dungi didn't pay any attention to the food at all. Well now, you don't want to go and buy slaves, Dungi said emphatically. Slaves is naturally lazy creatures, and the extra work you get out of them with a good whipping will barely last until you're out of sight. No, what you want to do is get better work out of your servants. The problem with servants is that they're always looking to steal from you, Amon countered. No sooner is your back turned than they shove a handful of olives into their robes, and they're always demanding higher wages. That and demanding paid holidays for this or that festival. They aren't ever content with just the days holy to Enki either. To hear them tell it, you would swear every workman was born as pious as a priest to all of the 7 and each of the minor gods as well. I hate to have to say this, Dungi answered, but I suspect that your servants are taking advantage of your youth. Was your father sickly before he passed on? He was sickly for most of his life, poor man, Amon said. He had me run as much of the business as I was able from a very young age. Well, there's your problem right there, Dungi said excitedly. Those servants of yours have been getting away with murder for so long, they just know they can push you around. They've been doing it for years now. I mean no disrespect to Tana, but it isn't that hard for a lazy scoundrel to fool a young kid. Now, what you need to do is show those workmen that you aren't going to be pushed around no more. You need to fire the worst of them to scare the others straight, then cut all their wages by 20%. Isn't that a bit extreme? Amon asked. Not one bit, Dungi affirmed. And that ain't the end of it neither. You need to inspect their robes before they leave each day, and if you catch one of them with a handful of olives in his pocket, why, you take him straight to the king, and you get his hand chopped off. Dungi pantomimed a chopping motion with a heavy thwack against the table that made all the nearby guests start, but Dungi was oblivious. You gotta let 'em know that you won't tolerate any more of their tomfoolery, Dungi asserted with a nod. I can see that what you're suggesting makes sense, Amon said. But it's so hard to find good labourers, and I'm afraid that if I let these ones go, it'll take me months to find replacements. Pfft, nah. Whatever lies those servants of yours have been filling your ears with just ain't true, Dungi said. There's a lot of slack in the labour market right now, and good labourers ain't that hard to come by. If you don't mind my asking, how much is you paying your men? 3 silas a day. Each? Dungi asked in surprise. He shook his head. Oh, this is worse than I could have imagined. Young man, your men are taking such shameless advantage of you that they ought to be taken out and beheaded. Nope, I'm afraid this has gone farther than what you can fix yourself. You're going to have to go out and find yourself an overseer. And not just any old namby-pamby one neither. You're going to go out and look for the overseer with the most ruthless reputation you can find. And you're going to have to let him take matters into his own hands. Do you really think that's my only option? Amon asked. Overseers are so expensive, and all of their wages come straight out of profits. If you follow my advice, I can guarantee that your profits will double within a year, and I'm talking net profits, after you subtract the overseer's wages, Dungi affirmed solemnly. With the way you're running your business, it's a wonder you haven't lost your orchard already. I shall certainly take your words to heart, Amon vowed. Thankfully, Amon's soup finally arrived, and he had an excuse to stop talking with the garrulous merchant. Amon felt exhausted by the conversation. As it turned out, Balashi was right. Faking an olive business was a lot of hard work. It was a good thing that Wired Kubi, his father's chief steward, had insisted that Amon learn a few things about the accounts at the palace. Otherwise, he would never have been able to carry the conversation with the cheap pot peddler this far. As it was, he was more than a little afraid that he had made a major gaffe in asserting that he paid his workmen 3 silas a day. The soup was surprisingly good, and as he savoured it slowly, in order to avoid giving Dungi an opening to strike up another conversation, he looked around the table. At the head, to Iltani's right, sat Erkala, in all of her garish finery. To Iltani's left was an imposing fellow with silver hair wearing what looked vaguely like temple robes, though much finer, so Amon assumed he must be a member of the temple council as well. The next 2 men in order did not appear to be associated with the temple. The man sitting next to Erkala had the air of a predator about him. A wolf's bared fangs would not have been out of place in his mouth. Although he seemed completely comfortable in his sumptuous robes, Amon would have sworn that he was carrying some sort of weapon on his right hip, and not just a small dagger either. Erkala was engaged in some sort of conversation with him, though her nonchalant air suggested that they weren't discussing anything of particular importance. If Erkala's friend was a wolf, then the man across from him was a weasel. He had a pinched, pointed face and bright, darting eyes that made Amon at once distrustful. The rest of the table appeared to have been an equal share of temple councillors and outsiders. A man and woman who were clearly from the temple wore plain white linen. Those 2 were seated furthest of any of the temple coterie from the head of the table. Apparently, simplicity and humility weren't part of the current fashion at the Temple of Inanna. If he had to guess, Amon would have said that the balance of the outsiders were wealthy merchants. Perhaps this meal was a bone thrown by the illustrious temple hierarchs to some of their major donors among the commoners. As Amon was making his observations, a temple outsider from just 1 seat up the table politely tapped Dongi on the shoulder. The man wore simple but costly robes, and a jet-black goatee and mustache, trimmed very precisely. Amon thought it odd to see a man who didn't wear a full beard. "Pardon me, Dongi, would you be willing to trade places with me? I would like to have a word or two with the young man seated next to you," the man said.
Certainly, Tirigan, certainly,"
Dungi replied. The fat man nearly fell over backwards in his haste to make way for the interloper, and then he worsened matters by knocking over his plate as he tried to disentangle himself from his chair. Amon thought Dungi's behavior very odd. This seemed to be showing far more deference to this Tirigan than the latter's place at the table would indicate he was due. Tirigan sat down, and sized Amon up with eyes that Amon thought too cool and calculating for comfort. "I have certain business interests in Eridu," Tirigan said. "I have been told that you are but recently come from there." Tirigan spoke slowly and overly precise, as if he had taken the time to memorize each word, and was being careful to pronounce it correctly. The effect was to make him come across as entirely insincere, as if each word he uttered was a lie somehow. "Yes," Amon replied simply. Tirigan's strange manner made Amon want to say as little as possible. "I am informed that you own an olive orchard," he continued. "Where exactly does your olive orchard lie?" Instead of answering, Amon asked, "What sort of business are you in?" With no visible change in expression whatever, Tirigan was able to transmit a sense of anger at Amon's impudence in ignoring his question. "I am a merchant," Tirigan said. "Where do your olive orchards lie?" Amon felt tempted to ignore the question a second time, just to see how Tirigan would react. His first reaction had always been opposition when someone tried to force him to do anything, even if it happened to be something that Amon wanted to do. In this case, however, something warned him that it would be unwise to trifle with Tirigan. However, Tirigan's pushy manner couldn't be allowed to pass unremarked. With an inward grin, Amon resolved to play a humble, slow-witted farmer to the hilt. "Down near the creek, sir," Amon replied. "If you head south from the big oak with the lightning-blasted branch all the way down to the bog where the frog-catching pond empties into it." "Where, in Eridu, relative to the palace, is your orchard?" Tirigan specified. It looked as if a muscle beneath his eye twitched when he said it. Oh, Amon said with embarrassment. It's about 2 hands left of the palace if you're standing with your back to that funny bush with the fiery leaves. That's to get to the house, but maybe you want to know the way to the orchard. I reckon the quickest way is to follow the ridge through the fancy flowers with the purple petals, if you see what I mean. It only takes a little while to get to the palace gardens from the old-growth trees in the orchard. That's if I were going to walk to the palace gardens, which I don't, because what business would I have in the gardens? Father told me 100 times that they are only for the king.
Tyrrgan definitely had a twitching muscle beneath his eye, Amon could see. He wondered if he kept it up long enough, if he could set both of the man's eyes to twitching. A sudden pressure on his toe warned him that Balashi thought he was pushing his little game too far. "Whom do you have contracts with for the buying and selling of your wares?" Tyrrgan persisted.
Oh, Amon said again. Are you looking for someone to carry your merchandise around in Eridu? Why, you want the carter.
Balashi actually kicked him in the shin this time.
How was he able to manage that, when he was twisted around completely in his chair, chuckling at something the woman next to him was saying? His name is Zuzu, Amon continued smoothly, as if he had intended to provide that information all along. He carts most of the oil for us, and I hear that he does business with the palace as well.
Actually, Amon knew for sure that Zuzu did do business with the palace. He was, perhaps, the ugliest human being the gods had ever created. Besides an eye that pointed off at odd angles, so that you could never quite be sure if he was looking at you, he had ears that stuck out like plates from his head, sparse tufts of hair that seemed glued at random all around his face and head, a skinny chicken neck with a huge goiter, and limbs that seemed as if each one had come from a different person, and had all been glued on backwards. Even so, Zuzu was about the happiest man that Amon had ever met, too. When he dropped off vegetables or oil or other things at the palace, he always joked around with anyone who happened to be nearby. Amon would swear that his braying laugh could be heard from a league away. Zuzu only showed up at the palace every 3rd day, so he must have contracts that kept him busy elsewhere the rest of the time.
Zuzu was a great fellow,
Amon continued.
His prices aren't too high either.
Amon paused, as if remembering something.
But I learned tonight that I might not be a great judge of what price is fair, he said, looking meaningfully at Dongi. So you'll probably want to ask him about that yourself.
What have you heard about the Thalate? Tyrrgan demanded. Amon was brought up completely short.
The what now?
He asked, completely at a loss. The Thalate, a religious faction that worships no god but chaos and have sworn to see the world crumble into ash, Tyrrgan insisted.
No, that's not something I've ever heard about, sir,
Amon said meekly.
But they don't sound very pleasant.
Oh, they're not pleasant at all, Tyrrgan growled. They delight in taking wealthy young upstarts and torturing them until they beg, screaming for death. Amon shivered melodramatically.
I don't think we have them in Eridu,
Amon said, with a squeak to his voice. Oh yes, you have them in Eridu, I assure you, Tyrrgan said. And I have it on good authority that those who mix themselves up in things they have no business trifling with are very likely to meet them, personally.
Okay then, Amon replied. Thank you so much for that.
Tyrrgan stood up without another word and left the room, stalking out through the dining hall.
He seems to have been in the bad mood tonight,
Amon commented across the empty seat to Dongi. Dongi just shook his head and said nothing. Amon tried to figure out what that was all about. Was he being warned off helping out Iltani? Or did these people somehow know who he really was and were trying to send him a different message altogether? Whatever the case, he found himself free of dining companions for the rest of the meal. He sat back and watched the people around him. No one seemed to be looking his way. In fact, as best he could tell, no one even knew he was there at all anymore. He glanced up several times at Iltani. She, too, did not have much in the way of dinner companionship. Every now and then, one of the temple outsiders came up and paid their respects to her, but otherwise she just sat there and picked at her food. Several times, when Amon caught her eye, she made tiny gestures, as if she wanted to tell him something. But whatever her message was, her gestures were too tightly constrained for him to make anything intelligible out of them. As the dinner drew to a close, the guests began melting away. When just Okala and Iltani were left in the room, in addition to himself and Balashi, Amon judged that the breach of protocol was small enough to be forgivable. He rose from his chair and approached Iltani. "That was quite a feast, Your Holiness," he said. "But I am just a simple farmer, and prefer much simpler fare and some quiet talk with my sister. Do you think it would be all right if you and I just had some bread and cheese at the Pool of Inanna tomorrow?"
"Iltani, it's time for you to retire,"
Akala said shrilly from the other side of the table.
"And as for you, Etana, I hope you enjoyed your dinner with your sister, for she is far too busy to be spending her time entertaining some supposed long-lost brother. I'm afraid you will not be seeing her again."
"If that is her wish, I will most assuredly do as she desires, but it is she, not you, who is the High Priestess of Inanna," Amon replied coldly. Akala did not take this flouting for authority well.
"Iltani,"
she snapped.
"Send this little nobody away while there's still something left of him to be sent, and do it quickly."
She turned and stomped out of the room. Iltani approached Amon, frowning. "I am sorry, little brother, but you had best leave." "Very well, but I will see you tomorrow at the Pool of Inanna," Amon said obstinately. Iltani's frown deepened. "I wish it could be so, but Akala is not someone whose word may be flouted. I thought Inanna would make a path for us, but if she has, I cannot see it. We must pray that another way may be opened." "I am not content to wait upon the caprices of the gods," Amon insisted. "I will be here to see you tomorrow." "Inanna grant that it may be so," Iltani said sorrowfully. Balashi's big hand came down on Amon's shoulder. "It's time for us to leave this place," he said firmly. "A moment," Amon said, as he irritably brushed off Balashi's hand. "Now," Balashi said, in a tone that would brook no argument. Amon sighed. "Very well, but I will return tomorrow," he insisted. Balashi marched him out of the dining hall and across the cavernous hall, Iltani following close on their heels. Just as they left the small circle of light made by the lamps burning inside the dining hall, Iltani grabbed Amon's hand and spun him around. She pulled him close. "Amon Shaw, I miscalculated. They will not let us see each other again, but you must believe that Inanna will make a way. Tell me that you believe it. I must hear you say that you will not abandon me." "I swore to you that I would protect you, my sister. I will not abandon you," Amon promised. Iltani hugged him. "Thank you for trying, Amon Shaw," she said. "We need to go," Balashi hissed angrily. Amon turned to go, but Iltani turned him back to her, placed her hands on his cheeks, and kissed him hard on the lips. Without another word, she turned and fled toward the Hall of Women.